Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Philosophy of X here on the Aspect Network. I'm your host, Alex Batts, and I'll be your guide as we take a journey to examine the world of X-Men through philosophy. So, for this week's episode, I'll be putting the spotlight on two of the biggest and most influential figures in the world of X-Men, Professor Charles Xavier and his oldest friend and a longtime rival, the Master of Magnetism, Magneto. For the philosophy side of things, I'll be talking about how each hold deontological and utilitarian views, respectively. This episode might end up being a little bit shorter than normal, as I don't want to get too into the weeds on Xavier's backstory, because we aren't that kind of podcast, and admittedly, I feel like most people will generally know who he is and what he's mostly about, and for Magneto, well, I have 3 whole episodes about him that you should definitely listen to if you haven't. So, as usual, to start things off, I'm going to give a brief overview of each character so that you have an understanding of why I picked them to pair with our philosophical topics. And then after that, I'll break down some of the philosophy with more in-depth talk about utilitarianism and deontology. Let's dive in. So, Professor Charles Xavier is the mutant son of a wealthy nuclear researcher, Dr. Brian Xavier, and his wife, Sharon. Originally, the nuclear research angle is the explanation for Xavier being a mutant because in the early days of X-Men lore, the X gene didn't exist, and it was instead nuclear radiation that made mutants, hence the tagline, Children of the Atom. Later continuity retcons have established other explanations and elaborations on Xavier's parentage, but honestly, you don't really need to know the specifics. It gets very complicated. All you need to know is that Xavier is born into wealth and a family estate in Westchester, New York. He possesses vast telepathic powers, being one of the strongest telepaths on Earth. He spent his early life traveling the world to help those in need in various wars and learning what he could about mutants, who were at the time not known on the world stage. He eventually crosses paths with Magneto, not yet the supervillain that we all come to know, and the two form a friendship. He also crosses paths with Moira McTaggart, an ally and researcher, who he would eventually form an off-again, on-again relationship with. Moira is complicated, but we'll get more into her story next week. The need to know there is that originally she was simply a human ally, but is later retconned to be a mutant with the power of reincarnation. Don't worry about it too much. A lot of fans know Xavier as being in his iconic X wheelchair thanks to a tragic accident. The accident's origins vary depending on which retcon you're talking about, but by this point in his history, he has actually spent more time out of the wheelchair than in it because of comic shenanigans. Regardless, Xavier eventually founds Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, which becomes a safe haven for mutants and provides cover for the original X-Men team who fight crime and evil mutants. Through the years, Xavier and his team often find themselves at odds with both humans and mutants with diverging ideologies, especially Magneto. Like I said earlier, you don't really need to know too many specifics about his actual in-universe story for this episode. Like most of the X-Men, things get super complicated. He's been to space a few times, he has a kid named Legion who he treats horribly, and also a twin sister whom he tried to telepathically murder in the womb. As I said, complicated. The main takeaway for Xavier is just to know that he maintains a relatively strict ideology of wanting mutants and humans to coexist peacefully. He's an assimilationist, and also falls in line with deontological thinking. If something is bad, then it shouldn't be done, regardless of whether or not you can try to justify the end results. For the sake of this argument, we will be ignoring all of the mind-wiping that he's constantly doing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. For Magneto's backstory, well, here's where I'm going to be a typical podcast host and implore you to go listen to my previous episodes covering Magneto. If you just want his character breakdown, you can just check out the first half of the first episode that I did covering him, but I would encourage you to listen to all 3 because honestly, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here when we jump into the philosophy side of things will have a little bit of overlap with some stuff that I already covered in those episodes. So the more that you know, the better. But suffice it to say that Magneto falls into a more utilitarian approach to his ideology on the human-mutant dilemma. He's an the ends justify the means type guy. That said, I think that's about it for the character breakdown portion of this episode, so we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll be diving into utilitarianism and deontology. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So today we'll be diving into deontology and utilitarianism. Before we dive in, I'll, as usual, drop some recommended readings if you're interested in doing some of your own research. And as usual, I am also taking a lot of reference from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entries on both topics. So for some good reading material would be Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill and Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant. A solid comic book recommendation would be House of X and Powers of 10, and listen, I'm not just plugging that because it's one of my favorite books. It's a really good modern take on both Xavier and Magneto's philosophies and how the two could possibly merge into something new. So to start, let's talk about some of what utilitarianism is. So utilitarianism, also known as consequentialism, has its modern roots with philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. As opposed to Kantian deontology, utilitarians believe that morally just actions should be measured by their consequences, hence it also being known as consequentialism, as opposed to the intent of the party committing the moral action. So the principle of utility, which is, quote, we should act always so as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, end quote, is a staple of utilitarianism. This does a few things. First, it sidesteps the problem of having any hard rules about what actions are or are not justified. Murder, for instance, under strict utilitarian methodology, would not always necessarily be considered morally wrong. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. It also separates utilitarianism from egoism. Utilitarianism believes that we ought to always pursue what is deemed good, and we determine what is good with the relatively simple equation that good equals pleasure and bad is the avoidance of pain or displeasure. It can therefore be considered a hedonistic viewpoint. However, it is not egoist in the sense that it is not concerned primarily with your own personal pleasure, but it is rather other-regarding. So it cares about other people as well. Going back to the principle of utility, it is concerned with the most amount of good for the most people, not just yourself. There's also two popular subsets of utilitarianism. One is act utilitarianism, which states that in any given situation, you should choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, let's circle back to that point of murder being morally correct under some ideas of utilitarianism. So, let's say that there are 5 patients who each need a transplant for various organs, a heart, a liver, 2 kidneys, and lungs. Then say that a doctor has another patient who's in a coma, but besides that is perfectly normal and a perfect match for the 5 patients who need transplants. Under act utilitarianism, it would not only be morally justified, but morally required for the doctor to transplant the 5 organs from the patient in the coma to save the lives of the 5 other patients. Sure, he's killing one person, but he's saving 5 lives. Now, most people would generally agree that this is not a good thing, even though it technically produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So here's how we get the other subset of utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, which is a version of the theory that states that we ought to live by rules that, in general, are likely to lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. So, rule utilitarians would posit that in the long term, a society that accepts and promotes the murder of innocent people is not a good idea. So that's the basics of utilitarianism. Now let's talk some deontology. Deontology is often associated with philosopher Immanuel Kant. In fact, there's an entire branch of deontology that is literally called Kantian ethics. In essence, deontology denotes that our most moral choices should come down to whether or not the action itself is morally right, regardless of its consequences. Kant puts forth the most well-known breakdown of this with his categorical imperative. A categorical imperative is a command you must follow regardless of your desires. Moral obligations are derived from pure reason. And Kant came up with 4 formulations of the categorical imperative. The first, and arguably the most famous, known as the universalizability principle, is, quote, act only according to that maxim which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction, end quote. Basically, this means that if you're going to do something, think about a world in which everyone else also does the same thing all the time. And then think about whether or not that world would be logical and also one you would want to live in. Take lying, for example. If you lie, you then imagine that everyone in the world also lies all the time. That's a world that, 1, wouldn't make sense, and that you also would not want to live in. Therefore, under Kant's categorical imperative, lying is morally wrong, regardless of the circumstances. Remember that under deontological restrictions, this means lying, no matter what, is morally wrong. So there's some pushback against this view. An easy way to think about how this might not be a great universal view to uphold is with a quick thought experiment. So, say that you're at home with your child, and suddenly someone knocks on your door. You open it and are greeted by a man wielding an axe. The man says that he's going door to door in the neighborhood and murdering any children within the home. He asks if you have any children in your house. Under Kant's first formulation, you are morally obligated to tell the truth, that there is a child in the home. However, I think that most people can see how we might not want to do that, to prevent the murder of a child. Most would argue that in this instance, lying is morally permissible. To Kant, though, you should never act in a way that's morally wrong, even if others are doing so, even for a really good cause. So, there's more that I could dive into with deontology, but I think that you get the general idea, and it's something that I've also talked about in previous episodes. So with that, we'll take a quick break and then tie things back to Xavier and Magneto. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, as I said earlier, broadly speaking, Magneto falls into utilitarian or consequentialist thinking, while Xavier maintains a more deontological approach. This has historically put them at odds with each other. Both want the same end goal, peaceful existence for mutants, but both go about achieving that goal in radically different ways. Magneto argues that the ends justify the means. He will use intimidation, aggression, and preemptive strike against humans with the justification that his results will produce the greater good for the greatest number of mutants. It's important to note here that Magneto is not a pure utilitarian in this line of thinking, or that he at least doesn't put humans and mutants in the same group when applying his calculus of the greatest number. If he weighed them equally, rather than putting mutants first, his actions would have to change to account for that. This is something we have seen him acknowledge in recent comics, with him going out of his way to save human lives in the recent resurrection of Magneto number 4. Generally, though, Magneto is more concerned with the preservation and flourishing of mutant lives, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to achieve those ends. If that means murder, violence, lying, whatever it may be, he will do it. This is in striking contrast to Xavier's principles. Xavier wants a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, and he doesn't believe that violence against humans will ever be helpful in the long term for achieving that goal. Him and the X-Men go out of their way to thwart Magneto, putting the lives of humans at the same level, if not at times higher, as those of mutants. For Xavier, killing and violence is morally wrong, so it is always morally wrong, regardless of the consequences that may come from that, including the death and the subjugation of mutants. There have been countless examples of Xavier taking the supposed moral high ground to the detriment of mutants. For example, in the most recent Hellfire Gala issue, Xavier is presented with an ultimatum. He's ordered to telepathically force every mutant on the planet to walk through the nearest Krakoan gate, not knowing what awaits them on the other side, and it could very possibly be immediate death, and that for every mutant Orcus finds left on Earth, they will start killing at 10 humans per mutant. Xavier forces the mutants to walk through the gates. Xavier might not be the one literally killing humans, but he feels morally responsible to prevent it because he can. Interestingly, though, there are also tons of examples of Xavier doing morally wrong actions, such as mind wipes, for what he argues to be the greater good, presenting him in a more utilitarian light. He's got a long history of mind wiping people to forget things that he deems it convenient or necessary for them to forget. However, if we apply the universal principle to mind wipes, we would find that to be a world that would not make sense. If everyone mind wiped everyone all the time, whenever they found it convenient, the world would fall apart. Xavier can be a bit of a hypocrite. Xavier also ends up folding on some of his assimilationist stance with the founding of Krakoa. I don't want to get too into it here because it's an entirely different topic, but with the founding of the mutant nation of Krakoa and the declaration of mutant sovereignty, Xavier gives up his assimilationist stance and stands beside Magneto and Moira McTaggart in putting mutant society squarely separate from the rest of the world. It's a fascinating look at how their ideologies can blend together when one of them gives some. It's always interesting to see the two clash because they really both want what's best for mutants. I also find it interesting to see where fans lie on the spectrum of who they think is right or more justified in their actions. So, to end this episode, I'll leave the question with you. Who do you think is more right, Xavier or Magneto? If you were a mutant, who would you follow? Would you fall somewhere in between? Would you reject both of them? Think about it. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Philosophy of X, and be ready to live life multiple times over as next week we dive into Moira McTaggart and reincarnation. You can find me online at APBatman with 2 T's, and please be sure to subscribe here to The Aspect on YouTube and any platform where podcasts can be found. please give us a like, leave a comment, and turn on that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on Twitter/X, Instagram, and TikTok at The Aspect Co. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.